This week's roundtable, Inu, Cassandra, and Prina were joined by Ken W. Good, a legal expert and member of the board of directors for the Professional Bondsmen of Texas, to explore the complex and often contentious world of bail reform. With a law degree from Texas Tech and years of experience arguing cases before the Supreme Court of Texas and the U.S. Court of Appeals, Ken brings a wealth of knowledge to the discussion. Throughout the episode, we delve into the critical role that the bail industry plays within the criminal justice system, discussing real-world implications of zero bail policies and their impact on public safety and recidivism. Ken offers a balanced perspective on the conflicting studies surrounding bail reform, some of which show alarming reoffense rates among those released on zero bail, while others, such as those from New Jersey, suggest that eliminating cash bail does not necessarily lead to an increase in violent crime. We also explore the methodology behind these studies, questioning the validity of their conclusions and what they mean for future policymaking. With the continued rise of bail reform across the U.S., understanding the full scope of its impact has become crucial for lawmakers, law enforcement, and the public alike. Ken offers important insights into how these studies shape the conversation and what is at stake for communities across the nation. As bail reform continues to be a hotly debated topic, Ken offers valuable insights into potential alternatives and compromises that might help bridge the divide between differing viewpoints. His thoughts on how to ensure both public safety and fairness within the justice system provide a fresh perspective on how these issues could be addressed in the future. Tune in for an engaging conversation with Ken W. Good as we tackle the complexities of bail reform and its impact on our society. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the Next Gen Politics podcast. I'm Inu. I'm a senior around the DFW area. What I'm kind of interested when I'm discussing bonds are the balance that you have to strike between rehabilitation and punishment and the kind of ethical satisfaction of doing what's right in terms of punishing people and making sure that people also don't commit recidivism. I think that whenever you're kind of going into questions about like prisons or like legal system, it's always interesting to see what is the best solution in terms of like kind of balancing that and keeping those two in tension. I think in some aspects we might go too far in either one direction or another. I wonder what Bond has in that. And I'm also kind of curious just because I'm not too familiar with bonds, like why it started and the kind of the origins of that system.
Hello, my name is Cassandra. I'm a high school junior who lives in New York City, and I joined Y Vote recently this summer because I have an intense passion for advocacy, and I definitely felt very supported and motivated by adults within the program to continue being civically engaged as a young person. I also agree with you that I'm looking forward to asking you about the correlation between bails and recidivism and what current legal frameworks are adopted. The criminal justice system is very interesting right now, given the investigation under Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City. And additionally, I think that this is a very important issue that's tied to our current political state. And I look forward to talking with you about it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Prina. My pronouns are she, her. I am a senior. I go to school in Manhattan, but I live in Brooklyn. And I'm so excited to have a conversation with you today about the criminal process. And I want to learn more about your viewpoint on bails and whether you think that's fair or not. Because I remember in the 6th grade, I actually asked my history teacher how it was fair if some people had the money to be bailed out and some people didn't. So I've always been long interested in that topic, and I'd love to hear more about what you think in regards to that.
I'm so happy to be here and talk to high school students or students on these types of issues. But I'm now at the age where you say senior, I feel like I have to say, I'm a senior, 63 years old senior. That really means something different to me. But, I will say that I hope that in our discussion today, you will see me as who I see myself. I'm someone who grew up in a very poor community, who grew up in a town where you really didn't go to college. You didn't learn. You were taught things that a farmer would need. But I had 2 public school teachers that taught me the importance of education. And so I went to college. When I got there, I found out I was way behind the rest of the students. I had to work my butt off to catch up. And then, when I got finished, I graduated in 3 years instead of 4 with a double major. But I worked almost full time, so my grades were not as good as they could have been. So I didn't get into law school the first time I applied. And so I had to work. I taught high school for 2 years. I got a master's degree in education, and then I reapplied to law school, and I went to law school where I did very well. I was on law review. I was on multiple national teams. I was on a team that wrote a brief that won an award as best brief in the nation. And I've continued to just find things that I like to do and continue to do that. When I graduated from law school, I started representing doctors in hospitals when they got sued. I mean, our trial team was on court TV. We were undefeated. And then I started representing some bondsmen, and someone had 45 default judgments. And someone said, "Who do you hire for that?" And they said, "Well, you need to hire this kind of attorney." And I've got someone in mind. So they hired me. And as a result of that, word of mouth spread. And I represent bondsmen across the state of Texas. I'm Texas counsel for several surety companies, and I have written numerous articles on bail related issues and on bail reform types of issues. In fact, since then, I've written an article about crime and rising crime, calling into question the FBI statistics and why we should question them. And article was published in the Attorney at Law magazine probably 2 weeks ago. And about 9 days ago, the FBI released new statistics that now show crime going up instead of going down. And so all the things that I was saying in my article proved to be true. And it's not because they didn't change it because of my article. It was just timing. And so here's a guy that came from a farming town, this really small town where 24 people in my class, only 4 of us went to college. And I'm living proof that you can do anything you set your mind to. So set your mind to it and do it.
That was a very inspiring story. I think it's just amazing that you still continue to produce work that is very accurate. Because I found it very cool that not even 2 weeks after you published your article that the FBI confirmed your studies. I understand that you weren't inherently looking for pursuing work in bonds, but I was wondering what made you stay committed to this particular field of law and how exactly it intersects with other aspects of law, specifically the criminal justice system.
Well, sure. First of all, I really like that question. It's a question that I like to answer because since I come from a really small town and a farming community, I really feel like I have a blue collar background. And what I think is a common element of people with a blue collar background is they are not afraid of hard work. And if you can mesh or if you can find somebody who ultimately gets a white collar job with blue collar background, they're not afraid of hard work. They're not afraid of learning new things. They're not afraid of being wrong. That's part of just being with your background. The reason why I'm still committed and have been committed to working with the bail industry is I have found there's a lot of blue collar people within the bail industry with those similar likes and dislikes and background. I mean, when I started probably 20 something, 30 something years ago, if a bondsman died, his business would go under because nobody else understood how it operated. Now here we are, we've got second generation bondsmen, family members taking over the business, third generation of family members taking over bail bond businesses. So people know how to run a bail bond company. They know the importance of it, which the importance is getting people to court. And I think those blue collar values is something that I connect with and I have continued to connect with. And also, I like to describe the bail world as a small pond. And so probably my ego likes the fact that in some circles, I'm a big fish in a small pond. And I keep making jokes that every couple of years, the government tries to take away my pond. But it's an industry where, like in Texas, every state runs their bail industry and then the federal government has their own that overlays it. But, like in Texas, everybody knows everybody. And so it's a small community of bail people. It's a family. And we're 2 weeks away from our annual meeting, and we'll have 250 people in San Antonio, Texas for 3 or 4 days with a skeet shoot, and everybody will get caught up. And so I think those are the reasons why I've still connected 30 years later to the bail industry and growing more so every year.
I'm just kind of curious about how you would characterize the bail industry, what role it serves in society. Is it filling a gap left behind by the government, or does it kind of play a crucial role somehow in getting things done? What do you see the role of bail industry kind of in the context?
Okay, so, if I was going to say, okay, I'm talking to people that don't know anything about bail, I would say, bail has been around for over 200 years. It is one of those things that we call it as a part of the common law, which common law is just custom and practice. So it's part of the common law that we brought with us from England with our early settlers. At one point in time in the United States, if you were bonding somebody out of jail, if they didn't show up, you took their place. Now, that was only for a short period of time, and after that, we changed it to a monetary. You were guaranteeing a monetary payment to the court if they didn't appear. The purpose of bail is very important. It is what assurance you're going to give to the court that you will return to answer the charges that have been filed against you. So what bail does, it ensures that you will return to court to answer the charges. Because, criminal cases are very, very different than most situations. If you fail to show up for court, your criminal case cannot go forward except in very limited situations. So it has to be put on hold. And so we have to put it on hold till you come back. And that may be hours, it may be days, it may be weeks, it may be never. So we have to wait for you if you fail to show up. So the importance of getting people to court is so the cases can get resolved, so the victims can get resolution, and so that we can just get the backlogs resolved and move forward with the new cases filed. And I like to say is how important is the bail system to the criminal justice system? It's very important. We're a semi close to being a government agency. Whatever's good for the criminal justice system is good for the private surety bail system. And I like to describe the bail system as the grease that keeps the conveyor belt of the criminal justice system moving. Think of it like this. Every day, every week, every month, the same number of cases are on average are added to this conveyor belt, which has to get them resolved. And within a year, you want to get the same number resolved as you get added to the conveyor belt. If you don't, then the backlog of your court is going to get bigger. And just the type of release you use will determine whether people will show up. And if they don't, then the cases get put on hold and the backlog grows because the same number of cases on average are being added to the conveyor belt every day, every month, every year.
Thank you so much for explaining that. I wanted to know what you think about what Elon Musk is doing right now. I'm not sure if you've heard, but he's created this way of almost dodging the legislation. He's created a way where he's allowed to do this, but people are questioning its legality. He's basically helping Trump out in a really odd way by having people enter a lottery when they register to vote. I wanted to know whether you think that that's a normal thing and whether we should have that or not.
Okay, well, let me begin by saying whatever is good for the goose should be good for the gander. I mean, we're in this time in politics where if you're on the opposite side politically, you're always attacking the other side. The last election, we found out we had all of these Zuckerberg bucks, which were paying people to register people to vote, or you could even say that some people would argue it was paying people to register to vote. And so you have things that have in the past that have taken place. And so Elon Musk is probably one of the smartest people in the country. And so when he does something like this, I would assume that he's highlighting something that has already been done in the past by the opposing party, but nobody raised it because it's usually that party that raises these issues. We're just in this period. You can look at the Supreme Court of the United States. Whenever they issue a ruling that one party disagrees with, then suddenly they're illegitimate. And the same thing, when a party loses the election, suddenly it wasn't a legitimate election. So I'm going to say that on that issue, I probably believe that this has been fully vetted before it was done and probably matches, probably on a bigger scale, but probably matches something that has been done in the last election to highlight the hypocrisy of one party now changing its position and arguing it was not proper when they were probably doing something similar, even if on a smaller scale 4 years ago.
So, kind of back on bail, I remember just kind of a general criticism of the criminal justice system that I saw recently. And I'm not like too familiar, so I can't say like it was valid or whether it was not valid. Was that a lot of the features of it include fees and these tiny fees that all just kind of build up. That when they get out, all of a sudden they're laden with like all this debt. And then as a result, that promotes them getting back into maybe like recommitting the crime and ending back up in jail, creating the opposite of like a virtuous cycle. And I was just kind of thinking about what you thought about like what role bond might maybe play in that and whether that has kind of any validity to it in terms of like being a general criticism.
Well, I think that is a criticism that the one side of the spectrum on the argument uses. And I will be the first to say that the private surety bail system is an easy target. There's a reason why there have been multiple attempts to try to change it to something else because, nobody really wants to have the private surety bail system. The problem is we don't have any alternatives that work well. There was a former judge who's a mayor of an urban city who was on a News Nation town hall, and she said, until we have an alternative to the private surety bail system that has the same high level of accountability and the same high appearance rate, then you really don't have an alternative. And that's what we're really seeing. We're seeing in our urban areas like in New York and California, and you see some of it in Austin and in Travis County, where they're trying alternatives that have never been proven to work, and they're showing drastically that they're not working, but we can't acknowledge that. Now, as to your question on costs, here's what I would say to that. The private industry usually is dealing with families. And so we're getting someone out of jail with one of their family members coming to us. So I don't really think that's a valid argument, because when the family, I mean, look, if I have a substantial criminal record and I feel like I'm a loser, I keep committing crimes over and over, but my family goes to bond me out and they're still saying, Ken, you have worth. We think you can turn this around. I think the value in that cannot be overestimated, because that's where we're getting criminal defendants to turn around. It's from family members saying, we still believe you. We still think you have value. And if we're going to get rid of that, then we're turning that very important moment to the control of the government. And I think that is very bad. The government in our urban cities has already failed schools. The dropout rates are very high. We've failed families. The numbers of families in urban areas that are not successful is very high. Drugs, the government's already failed drug abuse in our urban areas. And then we've got job opportunities. Those have gone down even more than they were. They were very low to begin with. They've gone down even more since the protest or riots, whatever you want to call it, from several years ago, because businesses were burned down and they didn't build back. And so all of those failures in the government's now saying, trust us on these new and improved methods that have never been tested. There's no science to back them up. But even though we failed all those times, we're going to fix it this time. I mean, where it's been done, it's been just atrocious. I mean, look at California and the impact of, we're no longer going to prosecute theft under $950. We have shoplifting run amok. $25,000 a day of shoplifting at stores. They can't withstand it, so they start closing. And then you have families that live there, can't go to their neighborhood to get their prescriptions anymore. They have to go somewhere else. And then commercial property values start dropping. We've got examples of property values for corporate properties in California selling for 30 to 50% of what they sold for 2 years ago. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, which has similar problems, 2 properties just sold for 9% of their value from their last sale. So this just creates like a snowball building, rolling down the hill, because the default rates on commercial properties has gone from 5% to 41% in just a few years. I mean, imagine the impact on all of that on budgets for governments, for inner cities. Suddenly we're cutting services. And all of this is a cascading thing because we can't provide public safety. We're letting crime run amok. And it all starts with, are you going to require people to come to court or are you not? It goes all the way back to whether you're going to have the private surety bail system involved in your criminal justice system.
Thank you for demonstrating how having this bail system is like an integral part of not only just our criminal justice system, but the way that society operates. And I was just wondering, because but Why Vote, what we mainly do is we have a whole section dedicated to where youth can talk about criminal justice and the changes they want to see within the legal systems. And I was just wondering if there was anything that you would want young people to do to, further understand the importance of the bail system and the initiatives that we can take to raise awareness and get in contact with those in the legal field about reforming the system.
Well, I think that reforming the criminal justice system right now is one of those areas. In politics, we're always looking for compromise, and we're always being told we should find a middle ground. But I am really concerned right now that the criminal justice bail reform movement is one of those areas where we just can't find compromise. I mean, look at the FBI statistics that we just talked about. That's the best example. For the last 2 years or 3 years, one side of the spectrum has argued crime's not increasing. I mean, it's not increasing, and it's just a Republican talking point to say that it is, and it's just a perception over what's really going on. And you really just need to look at the FBI statistics to know that crime is not increasing, period. I mean, I was on a debate with a law firm that has been filing lawsuits all across the country, which they keep losing. And that was their argument. And it's hard to find compromise when they're not willing to admit what they're trying is not working. And I'll tell you, there's a reason why they can't admit it, because so much of what they're doing is based on the premise that it's working. So they cannot acknowledge that what they're doing increased crime. Look in New York. They did bail reform 3 or 4 years ago. And what happened? They've now rolled it back 3 times. And there is a big fight right now in this election about whether it should be rolled back a 4th time. And imagine if we overlaid on top of that an acknowledgement that when they were discussing bail reform, that the advocates for it were saying, we know that if we do this, crime will increase, but we don't care. We just want the policy. If they were to ever admit that, the public would punish them so bad at the polls. And so I believe that's the reason why they cannot admit it's not working. And that's why you see a lot, like we've talked about recidivism multiple times. If you want to talk about a big fight over numbers, it's all over recidivism, because they can't acknowledge that what we're doing is increasing crime, and increasing crime by those people who are committing crime. And so they have to say no. And here's a study that says it's not increasing crime. Although all the law enforcement studies, which is the most accurate, they're the ones that look at recidivism all the time, they all say it is increasing. And what do they say? Oh, well, that's law enforcement. You can't believe what they're saying. I mean, they're the ones that look at it. And so I have my own podcast called thebellpost.com. And I did an interview with a former assistant DA in New York, and he was very good at explaining how they cooked the books to come to the result that recidivism is not increasing as a result of bail reform. And they used the same calculations that they used in Harris County for what they were doing, which is Houston, Texas. And so they've got things they've released using the same mathematical calculations. And I've gone through both of those and pointed out how that's not a correct calculation of recidivism. You start with people who've been arrested, and it's not the big pool to calculate recidivism. You start with those that are getting rearrested within a certain number of months after they've been charged. And if you do the proper calculations that law enforcement says, these reforms increase crime, increase recidivism drastically.
If I'm hearing you right, you're saying that there is a link between bonds and recidivism.
Yes, I am saying that
Yeah, wait,
because
so like,
what we're
what do you think
trying,
specifically about bonds increases in recidivism?
probably the family involvement. But I'm not saying this based on just my opinion. There's a study from Yolo County, California. They kept all their data during COVID, and they did a comparison. They've released multiple studies. I think they've released 3 now. But the first one was just, here's what would happen if someone was released on just simple release. That's what we're trying now. We call it different things in different parts of the country. In New York, we call it release with no bond. California, it's released on 0 bail. And in Texas, it would be released on a personal bond. But they're all examples of simple release. Your promise, only your promise that you will come back. Not any payment. Your family's not standing up for you. And so the second study that was released by Yolo County did a comparison between somebody released on a private surety bail bond versus somebody simply released, and someone low level, not violent comparison. And they found that the person released simply, just on a simple release, had a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense in the next 18 months compared to someone released on a private surety bond. Why? Because it's the family involvement, the family saying, it's kind of like when you go to church. I don't know if y'all are religious, but if you go to church, sometimes you get an accountability partner, someone who's to help you to stay straight and narrow, or to learn the Bible, someone to remind you when you get off track. I think the family involvement is on the private surety bail. They are saying, we still have hope for you. We still love you. We still want you to be productive. And there's consequences for us if you're not. And so remember that. Now, we had somebody that asked earlier about a question about money. Why is it fair that someone that can afford to get out of jail and then someone who can't? And I really think that's the crux of a lot of arguments that we hear. And I don't think that's a valid argument. And let me tell you why. Because the whole concept of the criminal justice system is we're going to only apply the amount of pressure needed to make you become productive, to decide, I'm not going to do that again. And so what is the pressure for you you're a high school senior, you're a high school junior, is very low. But what's needed for me, because I've been an attorney for 30 something years, so it would be something a lot different. And also, first time offender versus someone who has a substantial criminal record. All of those things. That's the reason why the criminal justice system is not intended to be, we're going to treat everybody the same. We want to treat everybody individually. And so if I'm poor and I'm a first time offender, well, then I'm not going to be held. It's my first time. And there's zero chance you're going to be held because you're poor. But if you've been arrested numerous times and then you get arrested and bail gets set higher, you're not stuck in jail because you're poor. You're stuck in jail because you have a criminal record. And I don't think there's any problem under the United States Constitution. In fact, the cases say there's not a problem if you can't afford bail, but you have a substantial criminal record. And so our concept, we're supposed to be very individual. The problem we're having, like in New York and California, is we're trying these things where we're going to treat everybody the same. If you just commit these same low level offenses and it's a list, then the judge has no discretion. They have to release you. And I call that a charge based release system. No matter how many times you commit that crime, they have no discretion. They have to release you. 1 time, 8 times, 10 times. And the problem we're having is that's being interpreted as a green light to commit more crime because gangs, organized crime, career criminals learn how to make millions of dollars under that system. And then the criminal justice system gets so backlogged, then they have to decide, are we going to just start dismissing cases because of the backlog? Well, that's de facto decriminalization. A de facto decriminalization is a green light to commit more crime. And that's really where we are. That's a kind of a summary of the bad bail reform measures we're seeing across the country.
We ask the guests if they have any questions for any of us.
Sure. Let me ask a question. So, do you know, as a 17-year-old, there are parts of this country that where gangs would be recruiting people of your age? Because we have states that have enacted laws that say you cannot be treated as an adult. So, when we find these holes that groups can take advantage of, like gangs would recruit you or people your age, because then you could commit whatever crime they want and you cannot be punished like an adult. You would be treated as a juvenile. And in these bad bail reform states, that's part of the reform. You cannot treat a 17-year-old as an adult. And I mean, again, it's a charge-based system instead of an individual review. Because, if a judge was looking at that, they're like, no, we're going to send a strong message to these gangs that we're not going to allow them to do that. So they're doing it where the judge's hands are tied and they can't do anything about it. I mean, is that okay with you?
I don't know. That's a very loaded question. I think I don't know. I mean, I think at least I know because my parents talk to me a lot about Korea because that's where they're from, and there's a big problem in Korea where there's a lot of middle schoolers that do crazy stuff, like they go running over people, like delivery workers. They can't be charged proportionate to the crime. They get really light charges because of their age. I don't know. I think individually policies need to be examined. I think in a lot of cities there kind of has been I think maybe in the past few years too much of a push in the direction of depolicing, and I think that's kind of caused a lot of backlash. But in terms of criminal justice policy, I'm just not too familiar with it. It's difficult for me to say either way.
Well, one of the other things I would probably want to talk to y'all about would be spousal abuse or, domestic abuse situations. Before all of this bad bail reform push, it was difficult for domestic violence survivors to engage in the criminal justice system. And so now in those areas where we've done bad bail reform, I think it's almost impossible. Nowadays, you have to plan your escape, plan your support system. And if you've got kids, figure out how you're going to survive. And then after all that's done, then as an afterthought, are you going to go to the criminal justice system? That's really where we are with these bad bail reform measures. I mean, there's too many examples. I mean, the best example I have is just an awful story out of Houston, Texas, where Caitlin Guajardo was married and she was pregnant with their second child, and her husband was already out on a simple release for leaving the scene of an accident. And then she filed charges on him for, beating her. And so he got rearrested. That would have been a violation of the terms of his first personal bond, but it didn't matter. He got a new personal bond right away, and he went home and killed her. And he didn't just kill her, he stabbed her 30 something times in her stomach because he said he didn't want another man raising his child. And I mean, that was probably 6 years ago. That guy just pled guilty to 2 murders and got 30 years life in the pen, but he can seek parole in 30 years. And I mean, I just think of that event is what stopped the progression of these bad bail reform measures in Texas. And it was probably the reason why Texas passed SB 6 2 sessions ago, because it limited the use of personal bonds for violent offenses, like Alex Guajardo when he got out on jail on charges of domestic violence and then went and killed his wife. But I mean, look how long all this took. I mean, the reforms that made the situation where it could happen, then the events that caused the backlash, and then I mean, it was 2 sessions ago that Texas rolled back or entered bail reform, which I think strengthened the system. And now 4 years later, finally justice for the family. You know, you can't say it's a victory. I mean, because the tragedy for the family will be felt the rest of their lives. I mean, they still have a daughter that's being raised by a grandmother. Those are things, you know, we can talk about the synthetic bail reform, what's good, what's bad. What we forget about is the human stories and the human tragedies. I mean, you could even go to the people in jail. If people are being arrested for misdemeanors and they perceive that as a green light to commit more crime, and they do, and then they commit felonies, and then they end up in the state prison system. I would argue the bad bail reform put them eventually in a worse position than they would have been because we made it easy for them. So instead of fighting for them, fighting to make them productive, we set up a system where we were really training today's misdemeanors to be tomorrow's felonies and making it a worse situation for them. So that's the reason why our prisons today are completely full, and they're full of completely dangerous people.
Thank you for providing specific examples as to how unsuccessful bail reform has further endangered our public. And thank you for raising awareness of these instances of violence. And it is very frustrating to see that it had to take someone to die and for a whole family to be uprooted for new legislation to be passed and for people to begin considering the implications that bail reform has on our criminal justice system, not only in preventing recidivism, but also preventing people from believing that our criminal justice system can be exploited.
Let me just say, I'm very hopeful on our criminal justice system. And the reason why I'm hopeful is because the status quo cannot continue for very much longer. I mean, we've had 3 rollbacks in New York. You know, we've had measures defeated in California. And so the public will demand public safety. Mayor Adams, we talked about him earlier. He's got troubles going on. But, you know, one of the things he said in a podcast was one of the foundations of society is public safety. And if the government cannot provide public safety, then you're not going to have a society. And so I agree with that. And the public will demand it. And so right now we're in this cycle. You know, in the 60s, we had this same cycle. We felt safe, so we were more forgiving on our criminal laws. Crime started to increase. And so then we had a fight between our politicians over how to address it. One side of the spectrum refused to be engaged and refused to do anything. And so the can was kicked down the road. And then eventually in the 1980, you had Ronald Reagan elected president and as a part of a backlash, and he had this war on drugs. I think we're probably seeing that same thing happen right now. We felt safe. We were more forgiving. The pendulum swung much further to the left because of these people, these advocates for change that are using studies that are not real. And so that only means that when the pendulum swings to the right, it'll swing harder to the right than it did last time, which I don't think is a good thing either way. And so you're going to continue the swing of the pendulum to the opposite direction has been delayed because of that issue. And we'll see again in 2 weeks from yesterday, immigration and crime are so intertwined and has become such an issue for people that suddenly NAACP of Oakland is demanding a state of emergency on crime. It's hard for the extreme left of the political spectrum to now say with credibility that crime is not increasing. And it's just really sad that politics has gotten to the extent that we can't decide issues like public safety or homelessness as just what's best for the town. We have to decide it from what's the politics of it. If your people want more information about my group or my positions, you can go to pbtx.com, which is the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. I'm on their board. And also on the menu, there's a link to the blog and also to our podcast. Or you can just go directly to the podcast, thebellpost.com. And there we look at just criminal justice issues. If you want to know what, the New Jersey plan is, we have an episode on that. We have multiple episodes about New York and their rollbacks. And so our goal is to just educate the public and legislators about criminal justice and bad bail reform. I think if we weren't talking about it, no one would. No one tells our side of the story, which is really the side of criminal justice and what works instead of what we should be doing.
That's all for today with Why Vote. I'm editor Cassandra signing off. Please check out our website at www.whyvoteny.org for links related to what we've discussed and to find out more about our work. And please recommend us to your civic-minded friends or to your friends you'd like to become more civic-minded.